Imagine an item that today costs more than a brand new luxury sports car. At auctions, this engineering masterpiece sells for a staggering $300,000. We are talking about the FG-42, a rifle that was half a century ahead of its time. The ultimate irony is that it was created for a war that had already been lost. This is the story of a weapon so perfect that no one could afford it. It is a tale of how the Reich's elite was handed a tool of the future, only for Hitler himself to forbid them from fighting the way they were trained. May 20th, 1941. The sky over Crete turned black with parachutes. 7,000 of the Luftwaffe's finest paratroopers, the elite of the Reich, dropped from the clouds to deliver another blitzkrieg triumph. But by that evening, half of them were dead or maimed. It wasn't a lack of training. They simply had nothing to fight with. The German parachute harness of that era was fatally flawed. A paratrooper jumped virtually empty-handed, carrying only a pistol, a knife, and a few grenades. All primary weapons, rifles and machine guns, were dropped separately in special canisters that the wind scattered across the island. It turned into a bloody chaos. New Zealander officers picked off Germans falling from the sky without even leaving their mess tables. Cretan peasants finished off elite soldiers tangled in their shrouds using nothing but hunting rifles and hose. It reached the point of absurdity. Many weapons containers landed directly on Allied positions, who then used the Germans' own machine guns against them. Crete was a victory that effectively destroyed the victors. Out of 22,000 men, over 6,500 were killed or wounded in the first 24 hours. This disgrace forced the Reich High Command to rethink the very nature of airborne warfare and realize that paratroopers needed a fundamentally different weapon. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was beyond furious. His private army, his pride, had been bled dry. But Hitler's reaction was even more painful. Shocked by the losses, the Führer declared the era of surprise airborne invasions over. He effectively banned large-scale paratroop operations, deeming them too risky and expensive. For anyone else, this would have been the end, but not for Göring. He decided he would preserve his elite units at any cost and turn them into the most powerful infantry on the planet. To fight effectively while surrounded, paratroopers needed a weapon that could replace everything. A carbine, a submachine gun, and a light machine gun all in one. The problem was that the Wehrmacht army leadership flatly refused to help. The infantry generals viewed the paratroopers as upstarts and claimed it was technically impossible to build a universal rifle chambered for a powerful full-sized cartridge. This was open warfare within the Third Reich itself. Göring accepted the challenge. Bypassing official channels and using his connections and the massive Luftwaffe budgets, he announced a secret competition to build the weapon of the future. Thus began the development history that would change the face of small arms forever. The assignment Göring sent to the designers was considered a cruel joke in professional circles. The Luftwaffe's requirements contradicted all laws of physics and logic of the time. The aviators wanted a rifle weighing no more than 9 pounds that could still fire the powerful 7.92 by 57 millimeter rifle cartridge. To put this in perspective, this was the same heavy Mauser caliber that when fired from a light weapon produced recoil strong enough to dislocate a soldier's shoulder. But the list of demands didn't end there. The new weapon had to be less than 40 inches long for paratroopers to jump with it, have at least a 20-round magazine, and be capable of precise semi-automatic fire as well as full auto bursts. Essentially, they were asking to cross a sniper rifle, a submachine gun, and a light machine gun into one compact body. The Army Ordnance Department officially declared it a technical absurdity. They were certain no firm would take on the project because light metal would simply shatter under the power of a machine gun round. But they underestimated the ambition of engineers who had been waiting years to rewrite the rules of the game. When most companies recoiled in horror from the Luftwaffe's insane order, one man accepted the challenge, Louis Stange. By then he was already a legend in inner circles, having designed the famous MG-34 machine gun. Working for the Rheinmetall Corporation, Stange possessed a rare gift. He knew how to find elegant solutions where others saw only a heap of incompatible iron. Stange understood that if he followed the standard path, he would just create another heavy and useless carbine. He needed a revolution. He discarded all the old canons of the German gunsmithing school. Instead of classic wooden stocks and heavy bolts, he began designing a structure that resembled an aircraft engine more than a rifle. The designer worked under a brutal deadline and constant pressure from army officials who prayed for the project to fail. But this only fueled Stange. He implemented solutions that would become global standards only decades later: gas-operated action-innovative alloys and completely new ergonomics. It was a massive technological risk. Louis Stange wasn't just building a rifle. He was creating a symbol of Luftwaffe superiority intended to humiliate the conservative Wehrmacht leadership. To make the rifle work against the laws of logic, Louis Stange used a trick no one had dared to implement in mass production before. He gave the FG-42 a double heart, a unique trigger mechanism with two bolt operating modes. When a soldier fired semi-automatically acting as a sniper, the weapon fired from a closed bolt. This provided phenomenal accuracy with the round already in the chamber, and no extra vibrations. The bullet flew straight to the target. But the moment the selector was flipped to automatic, the rifle transformed into a full-fledged machine gun. In this mode, it fired from an open bolt. This was vital so that the barrel, glowing hot from the high rate of fire, could cool down between bursts, preventing the rounds from cooking off. Would you like me to continue with the next part where the rifle faces its first field tests? But that wasn't all. To prevent the powerful recoil of the rifle cartridge from turning the shooter's shoulder into a pulp, Stange implemented a system we see today in every American M16 rifle. He placed the stock in a straight line with the barrel. All the recoil energy traveled directly back into the shoulder instead of forcing the muzzle upward. Meanwhile, a massive buffer absorber built into the stock soaked up the remaining shock. This was a weapon that adapted to the needs of the battle in a heartbeat. 1 second a surgeon's tool for a sniper, the next a lead-spewing monster. The appearance of the FG-42 caused Wehrmacht career officers to alternate between confusion and laughter. Instead of the familiar, elegant silhouette, they saw an angular construction with a magazine sticking out of the side and a strange, almost pistol-like grip set at an extreme angle. But there was a precise calculation behind this madness. The side-mounted magazine wasn't there for aesthetics. Stange understood that a paratrooper isn't an infantryman in a trench. He often has to fire while prone, literally pressing himself into the ground under a hurricane of fire. If the magazine were on the bottom, the soldier would have to lift himself up, exposing his head to bullets. With the side mount, the paratrooper remained flat and nearly invisible to the enemy. Even the grip angle was dictated by the requirements of fighting while falling and upon landing. It was simply more comfortable to lay down fire before you had time to take a steady position. Every detail from the folding bipod to the unusual muzzle brake served a single goal: to turn yesterday's paratrooper into an autonomous combat unit capable of wiping out an entire enemy squad alone. This was a design dictated not by textbooks, but by the blood spilled on Crete. When the first FG-42 prototypes landed on the desks of procurement experts, they nearly had a heart attack. Louis Stange's rifle wasn't just complex, it was defiantly expensive. For the weapon to withstand colossal stress while remaining lightweight, the production required elite grades of alloy steel with high chromium and nickel content. In 1942, for Germany, this was equivalent to making assault rifles out of solid gold. Chromium and nickel were extremely scarce resources distributed by the gram between tank engine production and jet aircraft skins. The Army leadership immediately used this to land another blow against the project. They claimed, "Why do we need one of these rifles if we can build 5 standard carbines with the same resources?" But the Luftwaffe was unstoppable. For Göring, the FG-42 became a matter of prestige, a piece of jewelry for his favorites. Producing a single unit took many times longer than the mass-produced Mauser 98K. Every part required delicate milling and complex heat treatment. In the end, the rifle became a true symbol of elitism. The common soldier in the trenches couldn't even dream of it, as it was created only for those who jumped into the heart of the fire. But it was this very elitism and over-engineering that eventually turned a masterpiece into a logistical nightmare. While Louis Stange was perfecting his creation, a real sabotage campaign was unfolding against him, not by Allied intelligence, but in the offices of Berlin. The Army Ordnance Department, used to total control over small arms development, saw the aviation rifle as a direct threat to their authority. Infantry generals could not allow a private project commissioned by Göring to outperform their official designs. A bureaucratic war of attrition began. Army officials flooded Rheinmetall with endless inspections and demanded hundreds of minor design changes that only served to drag out the process. They officially prohibited sharing the FG-42 blueprints with other factories, knowing full well that a single plant's capacity would never be enough for mass production. At one point, the absurdity reached its peak as the Army pushed its own project, the G41 self-loading rifle, which was heavier, more complex, and prone to constant jamming. But for the conservative generals, loyalty to the system was more important than battlefield efficiency. As a result, FG-42 production started with a massive delay and in pitiful quantities. Göring had to literally fight for every batch of metal, turning the rifle's production into a special operation against his own colleagues. This internal infighting cost Germany the lives of thousands of paratroopers who never received their ideal weapon in time. September 1943. Images of a daring special operation circled the globe as German gliders landed on the high-altitude Gran Sasso Plateau to rescue the ousted Benito Mussolini. These photos were the first time the FG-42 was seen en masse. In the hands of stern men in rimless helmets was that same futuristic weapon intended to be the symbol of Luftwaffe triumph. But here lies one of the most unfair pages in the history of this rifle. The world remembered this operation as the personal feat of Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite and an SS officer. Reich propaganda did everything to portray the SS as the main heroes, even though General Student's paratroopers armed with brand-new FG-42s did all the dirty work. Furthermore, during the liberation of Il Duce himself, not a single shot was fired as the guards surrendered without a fight. The rifle created for a bloody slaughter became nothing more than a striking accessory for propaganda photos. The world saw the weapon of the future, but failed to understand its capabilities in a real hell. Its true baptism of fire lay ahead, far from the flashes of cameras. The real moment of truth came in 1944 in Italy. The ruins of the ancient Monte Cassino monastery turned into one of the most terrifying places of World War II. It was here that the German paratroopers, nicknamed Green Devils by the Allies, showed what the FG-42 could do in a total meat grinder. The paratroopers faced 4 massive assaults. They were pounded by hundreds of tanks and thousands of tons of bombs, turning stone into dust. But as soon as the dust settled, soldiers with angular rifles emerged from the cellars and wreckage. The FG-42 worked where any other weapon failed. At long distances, the paratroopers picked off Allied officers like snipers using optical sights. But when the enemy closed in, they flipped the switch to full auto and literally mowed down assault groups with a hailstorm of fire. The Americans and British were in shock. They couldn't understand how the same soldier could shoot a man in the eye from 500 yards and then immediately spray them with lead like a machine gunner. In the ruins of the monastery, the FG-42 became the absolute weapon Göring had dreamed of. But even this defensive fury could not change the overall picture of the disaster at the front. Despite the triumph in the mountains of Italy, dry statistics handed the FG-42 a death sentence. While standard Mauser carbines were stamped out by the millions, and the new Kalashnikov would later be produced by the tens of millions, the total number of FG-42s produced during the entire war was only about 7,000 units. 7,000 units. In the scale of a world war, that is not even a drop in the ocean. It is a statistical error. For comparison, in a single month, Soviet factories produced more Mosin rifles than Germany produced of its Wonder rifles during the entire existence of the Reich. The problem was that Louis Steinge's masterpiece could not be produced in an ordinary factory by former schoolboys or prisoners of war. Each rifle required hundreds of hours of high-precision handwork. Germany simply could not afford such extravagance. While the paratroopers on the front line prayed to their weapons, those in the rear understood. This rifle was a dead end. It was too good for a country whose economy was already bursting at the seams under the strikes of Allied aviation. The FG-42 became a hostage to its own perfection. It could win a local duel, but it could not save a front that demanded endless quantity over quality. By 1944, the situation became completely absurd. Louis Steinge had refined the second version of the rifle almost to perfection. It became slightly heavier, more reliable, and gained a wooden stock and an improved muzzle brake. This was exactly the weapon the paratroopers had dreamed of in the skies over Crete. But there was one problem. The paratroopers themselves no longer existed as a branch of service. Hitler never recovered from the shock of the 1941 losses, so the elite paratroopers were turned into regular elite infantry. The Green Devils no longer jumped from the heavens. They were thrown into the most terrifying gaps in the front to plug breakthroughs by Soviet tanks or to hold back the Allies in Normandy. The rifle created specifically for airborne drops, with its folding bipods, compactness, and unique ergonomics, was now fighting in ordinary muddy trenches. Its technical features, which engineers had fought for years, became merely a nice bonus rather than a vital necessity. It was a weapon for ghosts, for soldiers of a non-existent air army who died in the dirt, never having waited for their finest hour in the sky. The symbol of Luftwaffe power had turned into a magnificent but belated monument to Hermann Göring's unfulfilled ambitions. When the war ended and the smoke over the ruins of Berlin cleared, a real hunt for the FG-42 began. American and Soviet engineers examining the trophies were shocked at how far the Germans had advanced in small arms design. But while the USSR went its own way by creating the AK-47, the Americans decided not to reinvent the wheel and simply cracked open Louis Stange's masterpiece. American designers took the feed system and gas engine from the FG-42, crossed them with the belt feed from the MG-42 machine gun, and got something new. The result of this union was the famous M60 machine gun, which American soldiers would later call the Pig. Yes, that very bulky machine gun that Rambo ran with through the jungles of Vietnam carries the genes of that German paratrooper rifle. The Americans admitted that Stange's concept was so brilliant that it was transferred to the U.S. Army with almost no changes. It is irony in its purest form. A rifle created to protect the Reich ended up serving its worst enemies for decades, becoming the foundation for the Western school of weaponry. The ideas Stange was persecuted for in Berlin became the gold standard across the ocean. The fate of the FG-42's creator, Louis Stange, turned out to be no less paradoxical than the fate of his creation. The man who designed the most advanced weapon of the 20th century ended the war not with honors, but with the stigma of being an engineer for a defeated army. After 1945, his knowledge was not needed in the new Germany, and his developments were simply stolen by the victors. In the final years of his life, the genius of weapon design, whose ideas are studied today in every military academy in the world, lived in obscurity. To somehow feed his family, he opened a tiny grocery shop. The man who created deadly gold worth $300,000 spent his final years weighing grain and sugar for pennies. Today, the FG-42 is the holy grail for any collector. It is not just a rifle, but a monument to an era when engineering genius tried to defeat common sense and the laws of economics. It remains a reminder that even the most perfect weapon is just a piece of metal if it stands behind a system doomed to collapse. The story of the FG-42 ended in dusty museums and at private auctions, but its genes live on in every modern assault rifle, a reminder of the time when one engineer tried to single-handedly change the rules of war.